All right, Michael Easter, 12% body fat is really the goal for a lot of people, a lot of guys for sure. Like a lot of times they'll say, I want to be under 10%, but a lot of people also know that at 10% body fat, you're getting pretty lean and you might have some deleterious effects on like your performance and stuff. I get that. So 12% is kind of the new 10% in a lot of ways. But what are some of the strongest habits that you can start to develop to get your body fat under 12%? Because it's not just about what you eat. It's about kind of like what goes on behind the scenes with what you eat.
Today's video is sponsored by LMNT, LMNT. I'm a fan of their citrus salt. It's super refreshing. They have their grapefruit salt, which is a delicious flavor. They have their watermelon salt, a bunch of different flavors, and that has that perfect combination. It has 1,000 milligrams sodium, 200 potassium, 60 magnesium, which is why I use it. It's the perfect ratio that I like specifically for me. That way I can use a full packet if I'm fasted. I'll use a half packet if I'm not fasted, and then drink the other half a little bit later on throughout the course of the day. I feel like I'm taking something in that's tasty, but I also feel like I'm getting something valuable out of it. And there's anywhere from 0 to 10 calories, depending on what flavor you go with. And they also have some really cool stuff coming out here soon. They've got some actual like ready to drink drinks as well. Really awesome stuff they're coming out with. But if you use that special link down below, drinklmnt.com/Thomas, that is a free sample pack, free variety pack of all their flavors with any purchase. So again, that link is in the top line of the description, drinklmnt.com/Thomas. And a big thank you to LMNT for the continued support on this channel, allowing us to do what we can do here.
Yeah, so I think that in the book I wrote called Scarcity Brain, I talk about this thing called it's this habit loop that I call the scarcity loop. Okay, it's got these 3 parts. And you can think about this as the most sort of addictive habit loop that leads people into repeat behaviors. So it's got opportunity, unpredictable rewards, and quick repeatability. So opportunity, you've got an opportunity to get something of value. Unpredictable rewards, you know you'll get the valuable thing at some point, but you don't know how valuable it's going to be. And then quick repeatability, you can immediately repeat the behavior. So this was developed in casinos, and it was put in slot machines, and it increased slot machine revenue by tenfold. One of the other places that this has been placed is in junk food. So I talked to this guy who's with the junk food industry as I am reporting this book, Scarcity Brain. And he basically tells me the same thing. If you want to get a junk food to sell, it's got to have 3 V's. It's got to have value, it's got to have variety, and it's got to have velocity. And that is how you sell junk food, right? It's got to be relatively cheap. It's got to have a lot of different flavors, right? So there's a million different kinds of Doritos and chips and cereals. There's also different flavors in the same bag. And then it's got to be quick to eat. So when you think about what leads people to eat too much, which is going to be the number one killer of your goal of 12% body fat, it's going to be that you're consuming too many calories. And I think once you remove these foods that lean on this loop, that is to say junk foods that lead you to eat more faster, I think you're going to have a lot easier time controlling your calories and in turn reaching the 12% body fat.
Question on this person that you talked to about, the 3 V's. Did it seem like was there like a disconnect between them and like what the consumer is actually doing to their health? I mean, because I don't think that it's like these evil masterminds, but I do think that they know what they're doing. But was there like a compartmentalization? Is he like looking at it? Are they just looking at it from straight up, just like, no, this is just what sells, and they're not really thinking about like the fact that like they're eating something that's like really hurting them? I know you're not in his head, but
yeah, I mean, I think the junk food industry knows that they sell junk food, right? The first word is junk, but that's also what we buy.
Yeah.
So ultimately, the consumer determines. We vote with our wallets, right? And so then the counter argument would be, okay, so what do you want the junk food industry to do? You want them to make their food not as tasty? All right. Doritos, I want you to make all your Doritos chips. I want you to make them not taste as good. People would lose their minds, right? One of the things that I write about in Scarcity Brain is that the world we live in now, with our abundance of amazing hypercaloric junk foods, there is promise and peril embedded in that. Never before could you eat a food like a Dorito and then get ice cream, and then get like a perfectly cooked steak, and then get X, Y, like just name all these different foods, right? It used to be that you would walk the landscape, hunting and gathering food. The food tasted terrible. You had to put in so much effort to get your food, and life was exceedingly hard. So we live in this amazing time to be alive because no one's starving, really, in the US, right? Especially if you're at a certain level of like low level of income. Like our problem now is that people eat too much. So there's peril embedded in that too. And so I think really living well today is trying to figure out, how do I navigate this incredible world of abundance that we live in? Because I don't want to live in a world without Doritos. I really don't, right? I want to be able to make the choice when I've generally eaten healthy to be like, you know what? I've eaten healthy. I've trained hard today. I'm going to eat that one food that I know is not good for me, but I'm going to enjoy the heck out of it and be happy that I live in a world where I can eat that food.
I mean, what a tough decision, like for a company to be in. Like this law of attrition, this happens over time, where all of a sudden it's like, okay, next thing you know, this is a $1 billion organization that's selling junk food, and you're asking us to just take a 50% haircut. I can understand the conundrum they're in, right? It's like you'd be like, you want me to, you mean you're asking me to be a non-profit, not profitable business for the sake of you want us to be the ones that control people's behavior by making our food not taste good. Like, guys, it's up to the people. Like, so that's a tough conundrum to be in, especially in a capitalist mentality where it's just like, okay, you want to keep on keeping on, and it's like no business like rightfully says like, okay, let's just, guys, we're going to take a 50% haircut off the top because people are buying too much of our food. Like, right. I get that. Doesn't make it right. But I mean, I get where that comes from. So, okay, so rule number one, I guess, in terms of getting under 12% body fat is just get rid of the ultra processed foods or gain control of how they enter your life.
Yeah.
Okay, what's next?
I would say 12% body fat. I would say maybe try rucking. So one thing that I read about in the Comfort Crisis is the power of carrying weight for distance. So humans are the only mammal that can carry weight for distance. This is the activity that shaped us. It allowed us to literally take over the world, to do all these amazing things as humans. But we've kind of engineered it out of our life, right? So we're good at running and we're good at carrying. Those are the two human physical superpowers. We're not actually that strong of animals, for context. And so many people still run, but not many people carry weight. And a way to do that, to sort of put this back in your life, is with rucking. So grab a backpack, load it with some weight. If you're big and you're physically fit, start at least with 20 pounds. I would say 20 to 30 pounds is going to be a good starting point for a fit male. So if you're a woman, 10 to 25 pounds, just depending on your fitness level. And then just go out and go for a walk. I mean, it's that simple. You can start with any backpack you have at home. To start, you can load it with, say, a sandbag if you have one. You could load it with some books. You could load it with some water bottles. Super easy barrier to entry. And it seems to be uniquely good at fat loss. So you're getting cardio, but because you have a load on you, you're also stimulating muscle. And so there's this great study. It was a small study, but it looked at backcountry hunters. So it had these guys who were backcountry hunters in Alaska. So they are rucking with super heavy loads for about a week. Now, when you're backcountry hunting, you only pack in a certain amount of food and you're walking everywhere. So you're inevitably going to lose weight. But the research found that these guys had actually gained muscle during this time. So you would think, like, if you're out starving yourself and walking around, you're probably going to lose some muscle. These dudes had actually gained a tiny amount of muscle.
Wow. I mean, yeah. I would guess, probably mostly in their legs, what they're carrying. But the bottom line is, you're putting yourself in a spot where you're putting more demand. Anytime the stimulus, it's almost like periodization. It's almost like how you would program a workout, progressive overload. You're adding more weight. If you go out backcountry and you are carrying more weight than your body weight, that is essentially progressive overload. You're going to probably put on muscle. Mm-hmm. I've also found, I had Chris Hinshaw, had interviewed him, and he kind of helped me design some of my ruck protocol for some stuff. And it's very interesting to see how much stress is put on the body to run or to do certain things to get your heart rate in a certain range for a long period of time. but walking doesn't just quite get you there alone, because you're largely sitting in that zone 1 where you're just not quite having the heart rate high enough. You're still huge benefits of walking. I mean, don't get me wrong, but like you're not quite getting yourself into that decently aerobic zone where you're really at the maximal fat oxidation that you can get. Like you're putting yourself, by throwing a ruck on and walking and maybe hitting some slight incline, you are putting yourself up to that upper threshold of where you are oxidizing fat before you start bringing carbs into the equation. You are really, for every sense of the words, you are maximizing the amount of fat burn that you can get in that time. Like it's nothing is going to burn more fat as a percentage than like reaching that maximum threshold, that LT1, your aerobic threshold, where you're like reach that maximum point of where you're oxidizing fat for fuel before you start tapping into carbs. I found body composition wise, training for this long ruck that I'm doing and not even putting ridiculous hours in, like my body has changed seemingly effortlessly. It's really wild.
Yeah. And if you want to know more about the evolutionary history of carrying, which I find most fascinating. So my background is I'm an investigative journalist and I go into interesting places and kind of report. And I had my sort of aha moment about the value of carrying weight and how we're so adapted to it because we were hunting up there. And so you might be familiar with the research from Dan Lieberman at Harvard that basically discovered that humans evolved to run long distances in the heat. So we're uniquely good at that too. So other mammals, they're not good at dispersing heat. So the way that we would hunt as we evolved is that we would run down animals in the hot sun and they would sprint, right? Animals are much faster than us, but we can outlast them. So we would bump them, we would slowly but surely chase these things down until they got exhausted from the heat, and then they fell over, and then we'd spear them. And then we'd have to carry them back to camp. That's the second thing we're good at. And so I realized this when I was hunting and carrying the weight back to camp of this caribou, like, oh, wow, we're the only mammal that can do this too. And that sent me down this rabbit hole of carrying and rucking and its benefits. And so there's a ton of info in that book about rucking.
Definitely.
Yeah.
All right. What's something else? What's the third one?
I would say figure out how much you eat now. A lot of people don't know, right? They'll go, I call it finding point A. And the person who most influenced my thinking on this is a guy whose name is Trevor Cashy. He's a really good friend. And, he said a lot of people will sort of pick a diet to get them to point B. They're like, I want to get to point B. I'm going to do this diet. But they haven't figured out point A. They have no idea how much they eat right now or even really what they eat in a day, right? They haven't really observed that behavior. And oftentimes in trying to find point A, that is saying like, track exactly what you're eating. Write it down. You start to notice some things and things start to change. And oftentimes this means that people will be able to reach point B simply by finding point A. It's like the 2 points converge, right? You go, oh, I didn't realize that I ate that much of whatever food it is. Oh, I didn't realize that I was eating around this time, which also happens to be the time my boss always emails me, and that's probably stressing me out. And I'm stress eating. All right, so just putting observation behind your current behavior will often lead you to make some realizations and your behavior will change. So this is called the observer effect. And it's a nuisance to scientists. It initially came out of scientists observing the productivity of workers. So they would go and they would watch workers work. And what do you think the workers do when the scientists are watching them?
They work.
They work harder, right? They're not going to slack off. Yeah. They're not going to BS with each other. They're like putting their nose to the grindstone. Well, you can flip that and use it on yourself and use it as a benefit. So I would say find point A.
Interesting. So that's maybe logging food, maybe even logging your workouts. I mean, it also exposes a lot of problems, right? You can't see these things until you are actually taking an objective look. I mean, I look at my son who's 6 years old, and I've learned more about me by watching some of his traits that are mildly annoying. And then I realize that is me. And I'm like, I realize how I'm annoying to people. Same thing has happened with my wife and our daughter. She's looked at her and she's like, I can't believe Emma does that. And she's like, but I do that too, don't I? I'm like, yeah. Like, but I now see, like, it's like I'm taking a look at me from a different perspective in a way that has doesn't have a developed brain to contain it and maybe hide it. So it's just out there all the time. Like, Tommy, why do you do that? Oh, probably because I do it, right? It's like, I've become a passive observer to myself to a point where I'm like, I need to correct this behavior. And it's how much of it is learned behavior from him watching me and how much of it is flat out genetic. I don't know. Like, just don't know. But the flat out case is when I observe it, I have the opportunity to change it.
Yeah, exactly. That is exactly it. Once you start to observe things, you can change them.
So with, okay, let's talk about exercise for just a second though, because besides from Rucking, you also, you spent years as an editor of, Men's Health, right? Mm-hmm. So you've seen a lot of things come and go, a lot of fads, probably a lot of interesting things, some things that probably worked for small percentages of people, things that worked for large percentages of people. But I want to pivot sort of your experience there for a minute. As far as exercise habits that seemed to work the most for people to passively get to 12% body fat. And again, random number, let's just say getting leaner though. Mm-hmm. Passive habits when it came down to things that they could do with their exercise or with their types of training that weren't crazy hard or fad to implement. Like, by and large, what were the things that continued to surface as like the common denominators? Okay, these things work when people need to get leaner.
The things that work, weight training. But what exactly are the specifics going to be? It's hard to say because in my years at Men's Health, I saw ripped people who were doing CrossFit. I saw ripped people who were bodybuilding. I saw ripped people who were doing body weight exercises. I saw ripped people who were climbing mountains for their workouts. It's like, do something. That's the lesson that I get from that. It's not that any one is going to be better. They were all dedicated though, right? They did it at least 3 times a week, probably maybe 5 hours a week. You have to put in enough time and you've got to do something. Now we can talk, of course, since we're just talking like generally get leaner. If someone was like, well, I want to go on stage at a bodybuilding show. It's like, well, I'm not going to tell you to climb Everest, like the mountain climber, right? That's going to be a different conversation. But if you just want to get leaner, you just have to do something. And then the question is, okay, well, what are you going to do? Well, if you're going to do something, you might as well do something that you enjoy. So find something that you're actually passionate about that you can stick to, because that is going to determine your long-term ability to stay at 12%. Great that you got to 12% for like 2 weeks and you flexed every morning and loved it. But then you go, but I hate the freaking workout routine, and eventually you stop. And then you go up to 22%, and that sucks. Instead, I would rather have you pick something that you really, truly enjoy, that you get a lot of passion from. That could be something that you do with other people. That works for a lot of people. That could just be something that you do alone. I'm the type of person who trains alone because I need that quiet time, that removal. Could be something that has a competitive element, right? Maybe the competition fuels you, but you've just got to pick the thing and stick to the activity. I will say though that usually some form of weight training really seems to help figure out where you're going to get it, right? I don't think you could get to 12% body fat running marathons, but I think when people say, I want to be at 12% body fat, what they're thinking of is how do I look in the mirror, right? Marathon runners are the leanest athletes, but like no one goes, I want to look like that super skinny marathon runner. No one says that, like right?
Kipchoge. They look at him and they say, okay, well, he's fast, but they don't, that's not what's going to go, land you the girl for having the ripped six pack and the boulder shoulders, right? This is not, but I really like what you said. And it's something that is so funny because in all the years that I've been doing this, I don't think anyone's ever said that the common denominator of like getting to 12% body fat is like truly doing something that you just are passionate about and want to keep going back and doing. Because my wife is incredibly fit, but a lot of what she does is involving horses, and like she'll spend hours lunging her horses and out there in the arena with them, doing some riding them, doing the posting. And like I used to kind of be like, oh, you should maybe go to the gym with me more and like maybe do some more resistance training. Never ever say that to a woman, by the way. I'm surprised she didn't. But anyway, point is like she found something that doesn't feel like a workout to her, right? It's hard in its own right. But then, my sister, same kind of thing. Like she's a mountaineer. That is her thing. I mean, she's in incredible shape, right? And I think sometimes we get very jaded by what we see in a magazine as depicting fitness, because sometimes what that is, as someone that has been in that fitness industry, like that is a very unhealthy look sometimes, a very unattainable look that is attained through years of loneliness and a lot of probably interesting history that leads you to look a very certain way. But when you start allowing yourself some grace in how you look at what does your 12% look like? Is your 12% a healthy, fit, relatively muscular 12%, or is your 12%, really a 7% that you're seeing on the cover of Muscle and Fitness that's not going to be attainable without some level of misery that most people don't want to go through, right? Mm-hmm. So what's it going to be? Like, it's discovered for me with rucking more. I enjoy hiking. Like 6 hours can go by with weight on my back, and I will walk out of that the next day, 2 days later, leaner and more shredded than I've ever been and ever before when I was on a bodybuilding stage. And I don't even feel like I worked out, even though I was.
Yeah. Yeah, that's awesome. And I think too that there's a difference between 12% body fat and fitness. 12% body fat is a look, whereas fitness is an ability to do something. So the good example that I would use is that I was not in the military, but all my friends who do, and I've done a lot of reporting on the military and talked to a lot of people about selection camps. The first people that don't make it are the dudes who come in super ripped.
Yeah.
You know who makes it? It's like the farm boys who have just spent their whole life out moving hay in the elements. They're not ripped at all. They're at 15%, 20% body fat. They're not that impressive to look at, but they have fitness because they've gone through this thing. So just because you reach a certain body fat doesn't necessarily mean your fitness is going to improve. In fact, it might suffer for it. Yeah. And I'll give you an example of that. When I go report the comfort crisis, I got to go spend a month in Alaska, right? In the middle of nowhere in the Arctic. We're on this big, prolonged caribou hunt. And I went into that. I trained really hard for that. And I was like, I'm going to get lean, mean, machine. I get out there and I'm ripped. Probably the most ripped I've ever been in my life. That was a terrible idea when days get -40. That was a terrible idea when we're packing in food, which means we don't really have enough food. So now I'm going to lose even more weight. That was not fitness. I would have been much better to go, I'm going to definitely try and gain, 10, 15 pounds of fat before I go out there. So what's the goal, right? You got to figure that out.
It's like people that go and swim the English Channel and stuff like that. They start, with an extra 10 pounds of fat on them. And I think there is a middle ground, a hybrid between fitness and body composition. Mm-hmm. I think there's a healthy balance that can be found there. But we also have to understand that what we have tried to achieve today with body composition and looking a certain way is a result of having to implement artificial deprivation and artificial stimulus through exercise to achieve sort of a fake fitness look, right? It's a fake fitness. We're faking our look. We're faking our ability to be fit because real fitness has been pulled out of our life.
Yeah.
Right? We don't have the need to carry logs over long domains and chop down trees and build houses anymore. Things that arguably, certain members of villages probably did have some pretty good strength and develop some good muscle as a result. But then you flash forward to where we are now, we have nothing but creature comforts. So we have to create exercise for ourselves. We've artificially added exercise into our life. And I know that sounds bad. Exercise is great. I love exercise. I'm obviously enjoy it. But it is artificial in the sense that we are creating an artificial fitness and then we try to inflict a certain look to reflect that, even though it's not real. It is kind of a facade.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And when you think about muscle from a historical perspective, muscle is expensive, right? You never wanted to be that big. The size that people are today, people are freaking huge today. And I'm not just talking about the people who are in the obese category, mostly from body fat. I'm talking about average weightlifters you see at the gym, right? The big guy at the gym, freaking huge. I spent a lot of time in small villages with hunter-gatherers and, countries with people who do hard work for a living. None of them are that big, right? The average size of a hunter-gatherer is 120 pounds, and yet they're pretty strong. Now, we've never really had that much of a reason to lift super heavy weights throughout time. What we're good at is carrying light weights for long distances. Sometimes those weights could maybe creep up to 100 pounds. There's some evidence of stone moving in Africa where people were moving stones for about 100 pounds. And it could have also been that we put them on animals. We're not really sure. But we've never really had to be that strong. Humans are just not that strong in the grand scheme of time and space. That's not our forte. So to your point about the word artificial, which is a great word, is like, we have to manufacture this. And it's all kind of cultural. It's like, well, I think it'd be cool if we were bigger. Like, that guy's like big and strong. Makes sense, right? But we've never been as big and strong as we have been now. Yeah. And so that takes doing certain things that are very sort of strange in the grand scheme of time and space. Nothing wrong with that. But I think sometimes that message gets diluted in some ways. If that makes sense.
What about developing these habits to sort of stave off the need for instant gratification? I think, we're largely addicted to food just because it's available. Some of us are addicted to exercise, probably like myself, right? The definition of an addict in so many ways is basically someone that has the inability to delay gratification. Like, they just can't delay it. I mean, lots of definitions of an addict, but I mean, to me, right? It's just like they can't delay it. They need to feel relief from their stress now, so they drink. They need to feel euphoric now, so they drink, or they do a drug, or exercise in some ways, get addicted to that, right? I need to feel the effects now. And so much so that you can sometimes destroy yourself. And then same with food, right? Mm-hmm. So how can we train ourselves to comfortably, or habits that we can develop to be okay with delaying gratification? Because there's no doubt that to a certain degree, getting to 10, 12, 8% body fat, like, if you tried to just get the gratification that you needed right here, right now, you would never get there. It wouldn't happen.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I do think that living well today, really, you have to choose short-term discomfort to get a long-term reward. And that's also very unnatural, right? Humans are wired to do the next easiest, most comfortable thing because that kept us alive for all the time. If you had the opportunity to have food right then and there was a lot of it, made sense to eat more than you needed, right? If you had the opportunity to just sit and not have to go out and work, yeah, it made sense to be lazy, right? It never made sense to move just to move, i.e. exercise. When I think about addiction, though, and in my book, Scarcity Brain, I have this whole chapter on it. I actually traveled to Iraq to report this section. There's this new drug called Captagon that's sweeping the Middle East. And the reason I think you see addiction pop up is you need 3 reasons. You need a substance or behavior that solves a problem in the short term. Then you need a population or a person who has some sort of internal pain they're trying to deal with. And then 3, there has to be few productive outlets to deal with that pain. So in Iraq, for example, you had the U.S. military come in and destabilize the region, right? So you have this war. So you have all these people who have lived through war. And there was never really drugs in Iraq because Saddam ruled with an iron fist. So war happens. You have these people who live through it. They have trauma. Then you have this drug called Captagon. It comes down from Syria and it just floods Iraq. And so you have all these Iraqis who are taking this drug to deal with their problems. So this is a metaphor to me for all addiction. People get addicted to things that give them a sort of short-term benefit at the expense of long-term growth. To me, addiction is like, I'm taking the short-term benefit at the expense of long-term growth. And this can happen really with anything. And it's usually trying to solve for some underlying thing. So in the case of the people in Iraq, it's some underlying trauma. That same thing can happen with exercise though, right? It's like you're going, I need to do this thing because I got a lot of benefits from it and now I'm kind of hooked on it or whatever. So I think you need to figure out what's going on. And I'll give you an example from my life. So I've always been a person who liked to kind of explore the edges of life into intense experiences, okay? Now, when I was in my 20s, that manifested itself in drinking. So I'll tell you, good way to know that you have a drinking problem is that all of your problems come from your drinking. And that was me. So I got sober though, right? So I was like, if I don't get sober, I'm going to die early. So I get sober when I'm 28 years old. The reason that I was drinking is because drinking was a very cheap, easy way to fulfill that impulse I had for intense experiences, right? Easy way to do that. My life was kind of boring at the time. I had a job that was like, yeah, it was kind of cool, but it was pretty straightforward. I didn't have that much stimulation in my life. And it's like, if I just drank, it was like, man, I could have an interesting experience. I knew it would be more interesting than if I didn't drink, right? Now, that came with long-term consequences though, right? You keep chasing that edge when it's that, like, not a good path. So after I got sober, I still had that need to explore the edges of life. And what I was able to do, though, is that I was able to apply it to something more productive that actually helped me in the long term. And that is to say, my work that I do. So I do a lot of work where I go into interesting, sort of far out places. I applied it to exercise in a way that sometimes borders on maybe that person exercises too much, but hey, it beats drinking, right? So I think asking the underlying question of why do I do this behavior in the first place that's hurting me in the long term is the question you ultimately need to ask. That is not easy. It's not like you're going to sit down after watching this YouTube video and go, yeah, why do I do that thing that actually seems to be hurting my life? Whether it's intense exercise and you're getting super into bodybuilding, and by the way, it's driving your family into absolute misery because you're a pain in the butt when you're not eating enough and you're like ruining their lives with the way that you eat, whatever it might be, right? You need to ask, like, why do I want to do that in the first place? Hard conversation to have with yourself. And it takes stripping away the onion. But on the other side of that, I think you learn some interesting things. And the nice thing that I like to say about addiction is that if we think of addiction as persistence despite adverse consequences, you apply that to something more productive, like you can get pretty good at stuff.
Yeah, so it really is. I mean, it is the accelerator that makes addiction the problem, because the addiction, being addicted to something that has a long-term benefit, I don't even know if it's really addiction. I mean, I guess it's kind of funny. It's almost like, based on the term, I guess it is. Like, you can be addicted to something. I could be addicted to nurturing my family, addicted to but that addicted has such a negative connotation. You can't apply it to that. It's like, okay, I'm committed, right?
Yeah.
It's like the difference between addicted and committed is almost, if you ask me, it sounds like committed is more about I'm committed to something that's going to be better for the long haul. Whereas addicted, I want this short-term hit. Yeah.
To me, like, the way to do the math is, so when you have an addiction, you're choosing this sort of short-term relief, but it might create long-term problems. If you start to have these long-term problems just pile up and outweigh the benefit you're getting in the short term, then something starts to become problematic to me. So it's very easy to see in like drug use, right? Someone who is addicted to drugs, they go, well, so doing this drug right now is going to give me the short-term benefit of being high. It'll make my life better in the short term, but it's destroying my life in the long run. So it's really easy to see with that. But other behaviors, not quite as easy, right? But it could be with exercise. It's like, if you're like, I need to exercise because, and I'm not saying you, I'm saying like the royal we, because I do this math in my head too. I need to exercise right now because I didn't exercise today. And what'll happen if I don't exercise? Meanwhile, your family's like, dude, we have to wait for you for an hour to exercise before we can go to dinner. Like, and that starts to create conflict. Well, like, maybe we do need to have a conversation now.
Yeah. Or reprioritization.
Yeah.
And you see a lot of people that were recreational drug addicts transfer into bodybuilding. It's very heavy, very prevalent. You see a lot of that. And sometimes the drug use manifests over into steroid use. Sometimes it doesn't, but I see that all the time. And they are in a lot of ways trading one habit for another, albeit I would gladly they take bodybuilding over what they were doing. And it's like there's such a wiring for that short-term benefit. Okay, that short-term, I need to do this. I need to have a mission, a purpose that's going to get me an outcome right now. And a lot of times it's accelerated with steroids to get them there faster. Hence, when people talk about steroids versus steroid abuse or steroid addiction, right? Like I could see people that are using steroids for a performance-enhancing benefit, and then there's people that are using them because they need that outcome and they need it fast, because otherwise, what's the point in me going into this squat rack and inflicting pain if it's not going to get me a result for 15 years. That's not sexy, right? But it comes full circle back to this discussion about getting to 12% body fat. And I think what I'm taking away from talking to you about this is that it's less about getting to 12% and more about how the hell can you stay there? Because 12% is a healthy body fat to stay at. You could stay at 12% and live a good life and be healthy. So how the hell do you stay there is the question we should be asking.
Yeah.
And forming those habits that allow you to stay there rather than how do I get there as quick as possible, cause a bunch of pain, and then have to move on to the next thing.
Yeah. And I think you have to make staying there rewarding. Right? Because we like to do things that are fun, that give us a reward. We don't like to live in misery. Now, I'm not saying that every morning workout is going to be roses and puppies, but I am saying that finding a way to make it easier and more rewarding around food, around the ancillary behaviors you do, around the type of exercise you're choosing, is just going to make it, I mean, what's the point of being at 12% body fat if you're doing all this crap that makes you miserable? It's like, who cares? Yeah. Right? Who cares you have 12% body fat? Not really many people, right? And so I think you need to figure out how to make it rewarding. Yeah, which is different for everyone.
And probably have less focus on the actual body fat percentage as the actual metric too.
Yeah. So that's another one is that the number is just arbitrary. Yeah. Right. And so what's interesting about in Scarcity Brain, I talk about how humans get captured by numbers. So numbers are very new in the grand scheme of time and space for humans. We've only really used them for about 10,000 years. They're not necessarily wired into humans, right? And then once we start using numbers, we get this complexity enters our lives. And so now we can quantify everything. And why do we quantify? Well, the reason we quantify is because we can get certainty from quantification. But one of the problems that happens is that people will get fixated on the certainty that comes from the number when the number is just a marker for something else. Mm-hmm. So in the case of 12% body fat, well, you don't actually care about 12% body fat, right? No one cares about the number 12. And this like DEXA scan that's going to show 12, got 12. No one cares. What you care about is what you think 12% body fat represents. What does 12% body fat represent to you? Okay, could represent a lot of things, right? Could be, well, I think I'm going to be healthier then. Okay, well, why do you want to be healthier? Well, I want to live longer. Okay, well, what else are we doing that's going to help us live longer, right? It opens all these different doors. Well, I think women are going to like me. I think men are going to like me if I'm at 12% body fat. It's like, okay. Well, what else could we do to make men or women like you, right? Maybe maybe we need to work on that instead. So I think sometimes we get fixated on a number, not realizing what the number actually stands for and whether there are more efficient ways to go after that goal. Okay, so another example to kind of help people understand this is grades and GPA. So I was a professor for a bunch of years. So GPA starts in like the 1900s. And what it does is it was not invented for students to help learning outcomes. GPA was invented to make the lives of administrators easier. Because very early on, teachers realized once you put a number on a person's academic performance, they start to get obsessed about getting the A just so they can get the GPA. Right? The GPA just stands for like, they did a pretty good job. But they forget about the actual learning part, right? The GPA is just so administrators can basically easily move kids through the system. But when I'm teaching, like all my students, they don't necessarily care about whether they really understand the material that we're talking about. They want to know what their GPA is. Like they get fixated on the GPA. It's like the point of going to school is not to get a GPA. It's to learn all these different things. Right? And that's what we're here for. And it's very similar to the 12% idea.
I've had the same exact discussion surrounding calories. It is very similar. Of course, getting an A+ is great.
Yeah.
Of course, it's better than getting an F. It means that you at least, just use the words retained, because I don't know if you learned. You at least retained enough information to get an A, okay? Same kind of thing with calories. Like, yes, it is a law that, yes, like, you will gain fat if you eat more calories. I'm glad that you achieved energy balance today. Okay, but if we sit here and we focus on 1200 you're missing the forest for the trees entirely. You're not necessarily eating to true satiety. You're not eating for performance. You're not eating to give yourself enough energy to perform. And at some point, there's going to be an equalizer that has to come into fruition. Like you can't just sit here and say, I'm going to have 1,200 calories, because eventually you're going to have so little energy that your expenditure is going to suck and you're going to end up in a surplus that way, right? So it's like, okay, sure, count your calories. You should know where you are. I think it's good for everyone to observe that. But when you start living on that number, I'm like, I need to be at 1,200 calories, or I need to be at 1,800 calories, I need to be at 2,500 calories. All right, like congratulations. Like here's your gold star. Like you got to 2,500 calories, but guess what? Like you're miserable to be around. Oh, and also guess what? Like your squat performance went down 25%, and now you're, losing your leg mass that's going to allow you to burn fat next week. So maybe instead we just focus on like, what are you accomplishing? Do you have energy? Do you feel cognitively alert? Like what are these? And again, it comes down to everything you've talked about in comfort, crisis, and scarcity brain. Like we've also just lost touch with our own feelings of true grit and like what is hard and what's not. So when something gets hard, we just like, it's okay to be a little hungry. Yeah. It doesn't mean you have to, well, it's because I'm at 2,300 calories. I was supposed to be at 20. No, it's because you're hungry. Right. Like, and because like, it doesn't mean that your body is saying, come on, man, you owe me 200 calories. If you don't give me these 200 calories, I'm going to be, no, it's just because life happens and you're hungry. Yeah. And that's fine.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, and I do go back to why are we doing this in the first place? It's like, I think it was there's this famous executive at Toyota, like back in the day, and he would say, you have to ask why. I think it was 5 times or 6 times. I can't remember how many times. I think it was 6 times. You ask why 6 times, things start to get interesting. I want to be at 12% body fat. Well, why? Well, because this. Well, why? Well, why? Well, why? You start to go down that, and you start to get to the heart of what you're actually doing this thing for. And I think we have to miss that. It's like you just pull this arbitrary, 12%, that sounds good. And we get captured by the clarity of the 12. Yeah. The knowing you're at 12, it's like much more certain. Because if your goal is, I want to be healthy, it's like, well, that's very uncertain, right? Like, how do you even know if you're healthy?
Yeah, nobody does.
Yeah, no one knows. Yeah. But 12%, when the DEXA scan comes in, 100% success. Right?
It's on the gram or it didn't happen, man.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Anyway, man, where can everyone find you, brother?
Eastermichael.com. I got a newsletter that's 3 times a week. Talks about a lot of stuff we've been talking about here. People will dig it. So check it out.
Right on, my man.
Thank you.